Well, if you believe that man-made climate change is settled science, then what our speaker has to say tonight might be a tad unsettling to you. If you believe that God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth, so we don't have to worry about the environment, well, our speaker has a different take. Dr. Calvin Beisner is founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, a network of about 60 Christian theologians, natural scientists, economists, and other scholars who educate for biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the proclamation and defense of the good news of salvation. Dr. Beisner will address tonight's topic from his biblical perspective, and following his presentation, he will take your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Calvin Beisner.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, and I count it a very sacred thing to have the stewardship of your time and your minds. So I would ask you to join with me. Dave has already prayed, and so I won't repeat doing that aloud, but please join with me as I speak, that what I say would please God and would be helpful to all of you. I would like to begin by just giving a little bit of personal background because as some people might look at my background, they'd say, what in the world is he doing talking on a subject like this? My PhD is in Scottish history, the political thought of the late 17th century Scottish Covenanters. My MA is in economic ethics, and my BA is in interdisciplinary studies with double majors in religion and philosophy and double minors in classical languages and classical history. So why in the world is this guy talking about climate change? What business does he have talking about climate change? Well, first, just to address the issue of credentials versus ability, all right? It took me 7 years to do my PhD in Scottish history, resulted in a 365-page dissertation that when I was examined by 3 of Scotland's top Scottish historians, they began the examination time by saying, look, we know you're nervous. We want to put you at your ease. We've already approved your dissertation. You've got your PhD in Scottish history. Let's just have some fun talking Scottish history. Well, that was very, very nice. I will tell you that I have done at least, and I would say significantly more than twice as much research on the scientific and economic and ethical aspects of climate change and of climate and energy policy as I did for my PhD in Scottish history. One friend of mine, a senior fellow of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, is actually one of the world's leading climate scientists. His name is Dr. Roy W. Spencer. He's a NASA award-winning climate scientist, along with his colleague John Christie at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. They won a NASA Special Achievement Award for their work monitoring global temperatures via satellites. That is the most accurate way we have of monitoring global temperature around the world. Roy, speaking to me about 5 years ago, said, Cal, you know all the arguments pro and con on climate change better than any climatologist I know, because we all focus on our little narrow slices of the pie, and you read it all across the board. On any typical day, I'll read anywhere from 5 to 20 articles in the field. Through the years, I've read over 50 books on the science and thousands of articles on the science of climate change, including hundreds of peer-reviewed ones. And I've read over 30 books on the economics and thousands of articles on the economics of climate and energy policy. In other words, I think I know something about what I'm talking about. But now I want to go back a little farther in my history and talk about how I got here. Why is it that I am interested in these things? I have to go all the way back to my toddlerhood. Fear not, I'll skip a lot, so I won't keep you here all night. When I was a little child, my father took a position with the U.S. State Department and was stationed in Calcutta, India. He loved his work there. My mother loved the place, and we came to love the people of India. I had two much older sisters, 13 and 11 years older than I, and one who was 2 years older than I. And 3 months into our time there, my mother contracted a virus that attacked her spinal cord, and she was paralyzed. Now, the two oldest sisters were old enough to go to school. They went to a school called Loretto House. Anybody here ever heard of Loretto House? You have? Why have you heard of Loretto House? Can you remember? Okay. Loretto House was headed at the time by a nun by the name of Teresa, Sister Teresa. She became Mother Teresa. My second sister, from the late 70s through the late 90s, went back and worked alongside Mother Teresa for many, many long months and sometimes years at a time. So we have a special connection with India and with particularly looking after the poor in India in a variety of different ways. My youngest sister and I were too young to be in school. My father had to be at work, my mother was paralyzed. So she and I were farmed out to different Indian families for all day, every day. Two Indian women would come to our apartment in the apartment complex, and one would take her to the home where she stayed, and the other would take me to the home where I stayed. Now, as we went through the courtyard of the apartment complex, one of my very earliest memories as a little child is of this beautiful, beautiful, huge tree, well, huge to a toddler anyway, but huge tree in the courtyard with a vine growing in it and big, beautiful red blossoms hanging from that vine. And I always loved looking up at that and looking beyond it to the blue sky and to the shining sun. It was a beautiful thing. And then we walked out of the courtyard onto the street. And we would walk down some blocks. I don't know just how far it was. I was too young really to keep track. And along the way, every morning, this is my other powerful picture memory, were the dead bodies over which we stepped every morning of people who had died overnight of starvation and disease. Now, it was a long, long time before I ever began to appreciate what God had given to me in those two sets of memories, the beauty of that tree and the horrors of poverty. Quite a long time. We were not Christians when we went to India. My parents, I would call them God-fearing Gentiles. They sought to be people of integrity, and I think they did very well at that. They didn't know Christ. They didn't know the gospel. They didn't know that sinners can be reconciled with the holy God by faith in Jesus Christ, who died for our sins and was buried and rose again from the dead, that being Paul's summary of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15. And that is the power of God for salvation. They didn't understand that. But my dad knew to pray. And early on during my mother's paralysis, he prayed. And by the way, he had waited 13 years to have a son. And I confess my dad was probably a little bit of a male chauvinist in those days. He got over it. But he prayed, God, if you'll save my wife, you can have my son. By which he meant, and he told me this, God, if you'll restore my wife, my son can die. 12 years later, we were at a Billy Graham crusade in Anaheim, California. And there, my father and I both were converted to Christ. And within a very short time, I began to be trained in personal evangelism, just one-to-one, telling people about Jesus Christ, by staff of Campus Crusade for Christ International at the high school where I was a student. I would witness to anything that moved. I was known as the campus preacher. And what we began to realize as the years went by, and I was constantly involved in evangelism, then I got involved in a counter-cult apologetics ministry, I got involved in philosophical apologetics and scientific apologetics, all for the purpose of removing obstacles along the path to the cross so that people could consider Jesus with open minds. What we realized is that God had answered my father's prayer. Because after 6 months of paralysis in India, when my mother was not supposed ever to have recovered, she just suddenly got better, completely. She died 2 years ago at age 92, having lived a long and healthy life and been vigorous all her life. But God had answered my dad's prayer in that he took me for his service, and I have committed my life to him ever since then. But what I finally came to realize after I studied the Bible a whole lot, and I was studying Greek and commentaries and systematic theologies and church history and reading the early church fathers as a freshman in high school. I mean, I'm just a nerd, okay? Forgive me. But that's what I was doing. You know, my friends were out doing other things. I was doing that. As I studied the Bible more and more and more, I came to realize that it had a huge amount to say about the Christian's responsibility to protect the poor because of their vulnerability and to assist in people's rising up out of poverty, overcoming poverty. And that's what led me to my interest in studying economics, because I wanted to understand what sort of economic system is the most conducive to people rising out of poverty. But I also realized as I studied the Bible that it has a great deal to say about not only the beauty of God's creation, but also our responsibility to be good stewards of God's creation and the temptation, and because of our inherent sinfulness, the ease with which we abuse that creation. And little by little in my studies, I realized that those two are very tightly interwoven. I can summarize how they're interwoven in one very simple way, and that's by saying that a clean, healthful, beautiful environment is a costly good. And like any other costly good, wealthier people can afford more of it than can poorer people. For this reason, if you want to be a good steward of the environment, you want to see people rise out of poverty. Because as a matter of fact, in environmental history, the greatest environmental disasters happen in the poorest countries. And by the way, because socialism is not an economic system that actually produces a lot of wealth and distributes it well so that many people rise out of poverty, because of that, the greatest environmental disasters also happen in socialist countries. So a clean, healthful, beautiful environment being a costly good and wealthier people affording more costly goods than poorer people do means if you care about the environment, you want to see people rise out of poverty, because it's as they get wealthier that they can afford to do something about the environment. One of the things that I discovered as I studied the history of economic development and of environmental economics, right, is a concept called the environmental transition. And basically the idea is this: as a society rises out or makes a transition from subsistence agriculture into the early stages of industrialization, pollution emission levels, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, solid waste, pollution emission levels rise. And there are serious problems. If you know the history of smog in London or in Los Angeles, or for that matter in Chicago, you know that there have been times in the past when smog was a very, very serious problem in those cities. The killer smog in London in 1956 killed thousands and thousands of people in a 5-day period. This was a serious thing. But the curious thing about this is that at the very same time that the pollution levels were rising, so was life expectancy, or we can put it this way, death rates at every age were declining. Infant and child mortality declined, despite the rising pollution. Why is that? You wouldn't think that. You would think that the pollution would be killing people off faster. Well, the reason is that the pollution wasn't alone. The pollution was the result of industrial activity that made food, clothing, shelter, transportation, medical care, communication, all sorts of other things that are valuable to human beings that improve their material living, including their health and their longevity. That industrial activity produced all of those things too, along with the pollution, and those things improved people's health far more than the pollution harmed it. So early on in industrialization, you get an increase in pollution at the same time that you have an increase in life expectancy and human health and all sorts of other measures of human well-being. But then an interesting thing happens. At a fairly low level by comparison with anything that you and I are accustomed to living with here in the United States, at a level equivalent to today, say a per capita income of around $3,000 or so, the emissions of all of those different pollutants begin to decline. Now, they begin to decline at different levels of economic development, but you can round it off to about $3,000 per capita per year. The emissions begin to decline. Now, why is that? It's because the people there don't like the pollution. They don't like the choking from the smog. When I was a teenager in the LA area, we had to move from Alhambra down to the beach because the smog was making my youngest sister so sick all the time. You don't like the smog, and you figure, not only do I not like this, I can afford to pay something to have it reduced. And so you begin to develop and apply technologies that allow you to get the same transportation, the same industrial production, and so on, with less pollution emission. So what happens then is that the emissions decline, and before long, they are below what they were before industrialization began. So economists of the environment call this the environmental transition. If I were to graph this for you, let's see, I have to think from your perspective. Okay, if I were to graph it for you, it would look like this. Pollution emissions rise, they peak, and then they go back down. So as I studied these things, I realized that a common perception in the environmentalist movement of how human population and human economy and human technology relate to environmental quality is quite mistaken. That perception is capsulized in a formula that was devised by Paul Ehrlich, author of the very popular and influential book, The Population Bomb, that came out in 1968, in which he predicted that the battle to feed humanity is over. No matter what we do to try to prevent it, hundreds of millions of people will die in mass starvations all over the world throughout the 1970s. We will run out of oil and gas and coal and all kinds of metallic minerals by the 1990s. And human beings will be starving and poor all over the world. That was his prediction. All of those predictions turned out false. But his prediction was based on his theoretical understanding of how people relate to resources and environmental quality. He views us basically as as consumers and polluters. We use up the Earth's resources, and while we're at it, we poison the planet. And he devised the formula I equals PAT. I is for environmental impact, which in this discussion is always negative. You never think in terms of something that people might do that improves the environment. I is environmental impact. It equals population, P, times affluence, A, times technology, T. The higher the population, and the higher the affluence, and the higher the technology, the greater will be the negative impact on the environment. And that's a fairly dominant understanding across most of the environmentalist movement. Not universally, but pretty dominant. What the actual history tells us is exactly the opposite. The wealthier people are, and the higher their technology, the better they can afford to keep a clean, healthful, beautiful environment. And you know something interesting? The more of them there are, the wealthier they can be. Why? Because such things as the division of labor and worker specialization and trade, all of these things maximize the efficiency of human work and therefore result in more wealth being produced. So poverty is more frequently associated with very sparse population and prosperity with more dense population. So Ehrlich's formula is entirely the opposite of true. Now, how does all of this relate to the climate change issue? I want to see if I can make the connection for you in a number of different ways. And I'll need to ask you to just hang with me. Some of this is not real obvious and simple. But I want to talk with you first about the concept that carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere are causing dangerously rapid global warming. Right? Now, the first thing that I want to ask is that all that CO2 in the atmosphere does? Is it? Well, there are actually thousands of empirical studies that reveal that adding CO2 to the atmosphere actually makes all plants grow a whole lot better than they otherwise would. You can summarize it this way. For every doubling of CO2 content in the atmosphere, you get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. Plants grow better in warmer and colder temperatures, and in wetter and drier soil. And they make better use of soil nutrients. They resist diseases and pests better. For that reason, they expand their ranges. And that means that all of the insects and animals that depend on them expand their ranges as well. Deserts shrink, vegetation grows to higher altitudes, it grows into higher latitudes, closer and closer to the poles. This is all driven by added CO2 in the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, satellite photography has shown this to be the case. The green and going into dark blue sections of the map show areas over which, during the period in which we've been adding CO2 to the atmosphere fairly rapidly, vegetative density has increased. The areas that are red or brown, orange, those areas show where vegetative density has decreased. Now you can see that the increased areas far outweigh the decreased areas. All of this comes from satellite photography. Now, in addition to all of this, plants improve their fruit-to-fiber ratio. And the result is more food for everything that eats plants, or eats things that eat plants. And part of that result is, with the greater quantity of food available, prices of food decline. And who benefits from that more than anybody else? The poor. The poor do. In fact, a few years ago, a friend of mine, a specialist in the study of the impact of CO2 on our environment, Dr. Craig Idso of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, did a review of thousands of studies on this subject that have been published from the 1940s on to today, right? And he concluded, on the basis of all of those studies, that the added value of crop yields around the world from 1960 to 2012 attributable only to the increase in CO2. Not to better farming methods, not to better fertilizers or insecticides or pesticides or anything else like that. Only to added CO2 in the atmosphere. The value of the added crop yield was about $3.2 trillion. And if you project out to the year 2050, the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere projected by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which specializes in this research, what you find is that you can expect an extra $9.3 trillion worth of crop yield around the world over that period. Now that's significant. And since what we are told that we need to do to prevent global warming or to diminish global warming is to reduce our emissions of CO2, I have to say that the value of the temperature restriction that we achieve by that has to outweigh the value of that added crop yield in order to be sensible for us to embrace. But that's not the only thing it has to outweigh. It also has to outweigh all of the benefits that we get from all the energy that we get from the fossil fuels that we use. And in the process of using them, we emit CO2 into the atmosphere. Energy to light our homes and our workplaces, energy to operate all our transport and communication systems, to run our hospitals and factories and refrigerators and TVs and cell phone systems, energy for pretty much everything we do all day, every day. Both those direct benefits of the energy and the indirect benefits of the added plant growth from CO2 in the atmosphere are tremendously valuable. And so if we're going to be persuaded to reduce CO2 emissions to fight global warming, we better be persuaded that the benefit of doing that is going to outweigh the loss of all of those benefits. Now, am I a climate denier? Some of you may have noticed that there were some folks out in front with signs protesting what I'm here to say. At least they thought that they were protesting what I am here to say. I walked out and talked with them. I believe in being friendly, and I think we had a good time. I invited them in. Have you all come in? Oh, I'm so sorry to see that. Okay, somebody, okay. I hoped that they would all come in. Several of them said that they would. Because they had signs indicating that they thought that I denied climate change, or that I was a science denier, or something like that, or that I denied that human activity has any contribution to climate change. I don't deny those things. I affirm those things. But I also affirm that throughout geologic history, Earth's climate has changed for natural reasons. Solar cycles in the Earth's, the tilt of Earth's axis toward the sun, cycles in Earth's position relative to the rest of the Milky Way, cycles in volcanic activity, cycles in ocean currents, and other cycles have caused Earth's atmosphere to warm and cool many times over Earth history, over geologic history. Now, what about CO2? Well, there have been cycles in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere as well. It has risen and it has fallen. It has risen and it has fallen. Interestingly enough, some of the periods in Earth's history when CO2 concentration has been the highest have also been ice ages, which might make you begin to think, oh, I wonder if CO2 is the control knob for global temperature. Because according to the theory, CO2 is supposed to make it warmer. But today, carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere is approximately 400 parts per million. That's 40,000ths of 1%. Just before the Industrial Revolution, it was about 280 parts per million. At 170 to 180 parts per million, photosynthesis stops and all life on Earth will quit. 280 was very low by geologic standards. 400 is even pretty low by geologic standards. Through most of Earth's history, CO2 concentration has been anywhere from about 2,000 to 8,000 parts per million. And plants have grown much, much better during those periods than they do now. Well, but does the carbon dioxide have anything to do with warming? I think it does. We're going to discuss a little bit about how much so in a moment. Do I deny that we've had global warming recently? Absolutely not. I affirm it. This is a graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is their most recent one. They put a new one up at the end of each calendar year. Usually takes till about February before they do. This goes from 1880 to 1916, includes 1916. And boy, oh boy, that looks like a lot of warming. Notice the colors. Red, hot. That's scary, isn't it? Blue, cool. That's nice. Cool, right? But look also at the vertical scale. It goes from minus 0.6 to plus 1.0 degrees Celsius. 1.5 degrees scale total by the entire scale. And actually, the actual temperature bars don't cover that whole scale. They cover a span of right around about 1.2 degrees Celsius. That's roughly the warming from 1880 to today. Now, think for a moment about how this graph strikes you when you first see it. It looks kind of scary. Suppose that instead we graphed exactly the same numbers without the frightening colors. That's the same information. One of the things that we have to realize is that a whole lot of communication about climate change is carefully designed to frighten, even if the actual facts are not frightening. So this is what we get. Still looks like a lot of warming, but remember the vertical scale, 1.6 degrees Celsius, that's 2.88 degrees Fahrenheit. In typical locations around the world, temperature varies by 5, 10, or 20 times that much between nighttime low and daytime high. And by 10, 20, or 40 times, sometimes 50 or 60 times that much between winter low and summer high. And guess what? We don't have catastrophes because of that. How strange. This is why my friend Dr. Richard Lindzen, who is Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at MIT, author of several of the most widely used textbooks in climatology, and really one of the world's most respected climate scientists, says, what's the appropriate reaction to this? Ho-hum. So what? That's exactly how he puts it. So what? But now, look what happens if we put exactly the same numbers in a graph on which the axis spans the 20 degrees Celsius. Is that what it is? I can't remember how I put this one. Yes, 20 degrees Celsius span in that graph. What if we put it that way? Boy, that doesn't look so scary, does it? But now, how about if we depict exactly the same numbers on a graph using the Kelvin scale, beginning at 0 degrees Kelvin, that's minus 273 degrees Celsius, right? 0 degrees Kelvin, and going up to just a little bit above the global average surface temperature measured in Kelvin. What happens? You see that horizontal blue line up there? That's what it looks like. The increase in temperature from 1880 to the present is 36 ten-thousandths of 1%. You could round that to 4 thousandths of 1%. And that's not likely catastrophic. And I'll suggest to you that we as Christians with a biblical worldview have a reason in addition to the common sense scientific way of thinking to think that that's not likely to be catastrophic. When God had created all things, he looked at them all and he said, and it was all very good. Genesis 1:31, right? Now, my friend Dr. Roy Spencer, who is principal research scientist in climatology at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, he is one of those NASA award-winning scientists, runs the temperature monitoring system from satellites. Dr. Spencer was meditating on Genesis 1:31 one day, and he thought, the climate models that suggest that adding CO2 to the atmosphere is going to cause dangerously rapid global warming all assume that water vapor, which is the most dominant greenhouse gas, it accounts for 95% of the greenhouse effect, CO2 accounts for about 4.5%. They all assume that water vapor responds to a little bit of warming at the surface in a way that magnifies that warming. It's called a positive feedback effect. And the result is that they can generate in the models, the computer models of climate, what's called a positive feedback loop leading to runaway global warming. And this is the entire basis, this is the whole basis of fears of dangerous man-made global warming. And Roy thought to himself, any system that is dominated by positive feedbacks is necessarily extremely fragile. You can bring one little perturbation into that system and the whole thing goes haywire. He thought, that is not, to me, a mark of a system that was designed very wisely. I can illustrate it this way. Suppose that this building was designed by an architect such that if I leaned on a wall, all of the feedback mechanisms of the engineering of that building multiplied the stress of my weight from my 275 pounds to 2,750,000 pounds. And the whole building would collapse. Would we consider the architect of that building to be brilliant or a little touched in the head? Well, I think we wouldn't think he was all that terribly smart. Well, Roy, being a good scientist, realized that, okay, a hypothesis is one thing, but you have to test all hypotheses. Roy had a little advantage in that he has control of the measuring instruments on board the satellites. So he devised an experiment. He tracked over a period of many years changes in local surface temperature in places all around the globe, literally the entire surface of the globe. And he tracked also how clouds responded to that. According to the theory that drives the fears of dangerous warming, if you had some warming over here in southern Illinois, you should have a decrease in low-level clouds, which cool, which means you're going to get more heat then as well, and an increase in high-level stratospheric clouds. Well, high-level stratospheric clouds warm the surface. And that means that the little bit of warming down at the bottom will cause more warming, which will cause more warming, which will cause more warming, and so on, in a positive feedback loop. That's the theory behind the idea of dangerous warming. On the other hand, if instead water vapor acts as a negative feedback mechanism, then you should find that with a little bit of warming in southern Illinois, you will have an increase in low-level clouds, which will cool southern Illinois, and a decrease in high-level clouds, which will cool southern Illinois. So he tracked both of them from the satellites. Guess what he found? He found that water vapor acts as a negative feedback mechanism on global warming. So that calls into question all of the models. But even so, you still need some more evidence. We're going to look for a bit more of that. Does human activity really contribute anything to global warming? I think it does. I really do. And it's because of something that's really pretty basic physics. Carbon dioxide is what is called an infrared absorbing gas. What that means is that as heat bounces from it comes in as sunlight, or as in the light spectrum of energy, comes in as sunlight, as that strikes the surface of the Earth, it bounces off in the form of heat, infrared, right? We have to use 50-cent terms to sound scientific. As that heat goes out towards space, when it collides with an infrared-absorbing molecule, whether of water vapor or of carbon dioxide or of methane or of ozone or whatever else, that molecule absorbs it and then it radiates the heat. Radiate, right? You get radius in there. The radius is the distance from the center of a circle to the circumference of the circle. It radiates the heat spherically from itself so that some of the heat that was going up begins going down instead. That's how greenhouse gases warm the surface of the Earth. So if you add CO2 to the atmosphere, basic physics tells us you'll have a warmer planet than you otherwise would. That's basic physics, and many climate alarmists is what I will call them, those who believe that human contribution to global warming is dangerous, will tell you, look, if you question the notion of dangerous man-made global warming, you're obviously a science denier, because this is basic physics. I agree, it's basic physics. So also is the fact that if you drop a rock and a feather from the same height at the same moment, they will hit the ground at the same moment, if they're in a vacuum. But if they're in air, the rock will plummet and the feather will go like this, right? And if it's windy, the feather might blow up into a tree and get stuck and never come down. In other words, basic physics really doesn't tell you much at all about what happens in the real world, because the real world is a very complicated place. So the big question is, how much warming does come from adding CO2 to the atmosphere? Well, one fundamental formula in basic physics is called the Stefan-Boltzmann equation, and that tells us that if you were to double the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, you ought to raise global average surface temperature by about 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius. I don't know any climate change skeptics, and by the way, I know most of the most important ones around the world. I work with them all the time. I don't know any of them who would question that. So about 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming from doubled CO2. By the way, from the Industrial Revolution to now, we've gone from about 280 to about 400 parts per million. That's about a 43% increase. So we're not doubled yet. We'll probably reach that late in this century. And then, by the way, it takes about another century or two for the complete warming from that CO2 to happen, because the feedback mechanisms take some time. But pre-feedback, without taking into account any feedbacks, 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius is a pretty solidly established figure. So the real question is, when we account for those feedbacks, how much warming is there? Well, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that the warming from doubled CO2 should be about 2.7 to 8.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, I just switched from Celsius to Fahrenheit. I ought to be being consistent here. They say from about 1.5 degrees Celsius to about 4.5 degrees Celsius, with a best estimate of 3 degrees, which is 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, given that the rate at which we are adding GHGs, the models that the IPCC works with predict that global average surface temperature should be rising about 0.39 degree Fahrenheit per decade since the 1970s. But our actual observations tell us that instead they're rising at about 0.21 degree Fahrenheit per decade. In other words, the models, shown in the red line there, predict almost twice as much warming as actually observed over this period, whether observed by satellites, the blue line, or by weather balloons, the green line, or by what's called the reanalysis of a whole package of different data sources, the orange line there, which so overlaps the green line that the two together pretty much appear one line brown, all right? So, even if all of the warming observed over that period came only from CO2, the models exaggerate the warming by about 2 to 3 times. But not all that warming comes from adding GHGs to the atmosphere. some of it comes from other causes. Now, this is the first page of a study published last fall, second edition put out about a week ago, by two friends of mine, Dr. John Christie and Dr. Joe DeLeo, and then also Dr. James Wallace, who is an econometrician specializing in the application of economic statistical methods to global temperature data. The gist of this, and it's a very complicated paper, it goes about 50 pages long. The gist of this is that after you control for solar and volcanic and ocean current causes of global temperature change, most important among those ocean currents being the El Niño Southern Oscillation, once you control for those, you have explained all of the measured warming over the relevant period. In other words, there's no warming left to attribute to CO2. Now, please, don't misunderstand me. I am not denying that CO2 contributes to global warming. That's basic physics. What I am saying is that the empirical study tells us that the feedback mechanisms, no matter what any one of them is, and there are literally thousands of them, and most of them we do not know how to quantify, and a fair number of them we don't know whether they're positive or negative. The climate system is the most complex natural system we've ever studied, with the exception of the human brain and DNA. But I'm not saying CO2 doesn't contribute. What I am saying is that by basic physics it must contribute, but it contributes so little that we cannot detect the effect of what we've added. Now, another reason to question the idea that CO2 is the primary driver of global warming is that CO2's correlation with temperature is very poor. This is a curve showing the addition of CO2 to the atmosphere from 1960 to goes up through 2015. You can see it's a pretty smooth curve. The little ups and downs in the red there, that's annual variation. As in the northern hemisphere summer, and there's much more land in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere summer, CO2 concentration falls because plants absorb it. In the winter, it rises because plants die and release it. But long haul, it's going upward, and it's going pretty smoothly. But global average surface temperatures rise has been intermittent. Yes, there's the long-term rise, but through that period, there are periods of stasis, periods of no change. The most recent one went from early 1997 to almost the end of 2015, a period that was at its maximum 18 years and 10 months. According to the U.S. Global Change Program, the federal government program on that, it is not possible to reconcile the computer models with a period of stasis exceeding 12 years. This was 50% longer than that. That means the models have a really, really tough time. In fact, it means that the models are invalidated. There's one more thing that invalidates the models, and that is that when we look at the actual temporal sequence between CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and temperature change in the atmosphere, we discover that temperature changes first and CO2 changes afterward. Probably the most important explanation for why that is so is that as seawater warms, it releases CO2, and as it cools, it sequesters CO2. And the oceans, being a far more massive body than the atmosphere, they lag behind the atmosphere. So when the atmosphere warms, CO2 is released from the oceans later. In other words, to apply a very, very technical scientific phrase to it, the alarmists put the cart before the horse. So, summary so far. CO2 doesn't appear to be a temperature control knob for the atmosphere. Yet prescriptions to fight climate change all focus on reducing our emissions of CO2, and that is achievable only by a drastic reduction in our use of fossil fuels for energy. Well, what should we think of those policies? Let me start by asking you a question. How many calories do you consume each day? Anybody brave enough to shout out a number? How many calories do you consume each day? About 1,300? Somebody over here said, what else? About 2,000? I should be an auctioneer. About 3,000? Actually, according to the U.S. Health Department, the average for Americans is about 2,700 calories per day. But if you answered anything remotely close to that, you are way wrong. The average American consumes approximately 186,000 calories per day. And you say, Beisner, you're nuts. I don't eat that much. Well, neither do I. But you're assuming that I'm talking about the calories that you take in by food through your mouth. Calorie is a measure of energy. And 98% of all the energy you consume is not food. It's the electricity that runs your lights and your refrigerator and your TV and your computer and your air conditioning and your heating. And it's the gas that moves your car down the road, or the diesel. 98% of all the energy you consume is not food. Now, in centuries past, hardly anybody consumed that much energy. Maybe 1 in 100 people might have consumed 186,000 calories per day. But they couldn't get it through electricity that ran lights, or gas or diesel that moved cars down the road, because those things didn't exist yet. How did they get those 186,000 calories? Well, they employed the muscle power of animals, but they also employed slaves. Each person who consumed that much had to be taking the energy equivalent of another 99 human beings to do this. And when we figured out how to transform the energy bound up in coal and oil and natural gas into electricity and the fuel for internal combustion engines, in other words, how to make it into machine power, we enabled not just those very, very few, 1 in 100 people, but everybody to be consuming 186,000 calories per day without enslaving anybody. In other words, our capacity to get energy from fossil fuels was a very important factor in eliminating slavery in the world. Now, as an aside, I will tell you, slavery is coming back in the world. And the most common form of it is human sex trafficking. I'll tell you an ironic mix of facts here. When Pope Francis first became Pope, his first order to his bishops all over the world was to make their number one priority fighting human sex trafficking. Not long after that, he issued an encyclical called Laudato Si', an encyclical on the environment. And much of it, by the way, is very, very good. But the only thing that really got much attention in the news, because most of the media didn't like most of his message throughout the rest of it, was a 4-paragraph session on global warming, in which he said that global warming is a true catastrophe and we all must join in fighting against global warming. His 3 chief advisors in producing that section were General Secretary Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, Jeffrey Sachs of the United Nations Millennium Development Fund Program, and Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, a German climatologist and politician, all 3 of whom are fervent champions of reducing human population so as to reduce the use of energy, so as to reduce CO2 emissions, so as to fight global warming. Where's the irony in all of this? All of them support government-run family planning programs. And though in principle it doesn't have to be this way, historically it is this way, every government-run family planning program used around the world, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, has resulted in sex selection abortions. In a very poor society, a male child is the promise of support when you get old. A female child, not so much. And if your government is going to punish you for having more than 1 or 2 children, then you get a sonogram, and if you find that that's a female child, you abort. The consequence is that throughout much of Asia today, the ratio of adult males to adult females is pretty close to what it is in China right now, roughly 120 to 100. In other words, 1 out of every 6 adult males in China cannot have a wife because there aren't enough women to go around. But they still have testosterone coursing through their bodies. The result is a huge increase in demand for prostitution and pornography. And you know, for some strange reason, the vast majority of women just don't want to do that voluntarily. Thank God. But what happens? They're kidnapped. And now, scores of millions are sex slaves around the world because of that. So the huge irony is that Pope Francis first told his bishops, fight sex trafficking as your number 1 priority, and then he said, fight global warming, including through population reduction programs, and the latter prescription causes the problem he wants to solve in the former prescription. That is terribly tragic. Well, today, we get about 87% of all the energy used in the world from fossil fuels. 7% from nuclear and 4% from hydro. Altogether, that's 98%. Leaves about 2% provided by wind and solar and geothermal and biofuels and the like, right? And harnessing fossil fuel energy through machines was crucial to our eliminating slavery from so much of the world. Yet, climate change advocates tell us that we must reduce our use of fossil fuels. They tell us that we have to fight our addiction to fossil fuels. Even President George W. Bush spoke of an addiction to fossil fuels. Well, one might as well demand that the average person cut his food intake from 2,700 calories per day to 300 because the other 2,400 are merely his addiction. Listen, my friends. Abundant, affordable, reliable energy is absolutely indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty and the high rates of disease and premature death that invariably accompany it. And fossil fuels are today and will continue to be for many decades to come the best source of that energy to deliver people from poverty. Now, don't misunderstand me. Please don't misunderstand me. As my friend Dr. Will Happer, Emeritus Professor of Physics at Princeton and former Director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Science, notes in a paper that he recently published, fossil fuels must be extracted responsibly, minimizing environmental damage from mining and drilling operations, and with due consideration of costs and benefits. Similarly, fossil fuels must be burned responsibly, deploying cost-effective technologies that minimize emissions of real pollutants, such as fly ash, carbon monoxide, oxides of sulfur and nitrogen, heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, and so on. Those are the real risks from fossil fuels. And in developed countries, we apply technologies that minimize those risks to the point where essentially they are negligible. They're certainly not enough to counterbalance the enormous value of all that energy. But carbon dioxide, which, by the way, is safe for humans at levels of 5,000 parts per million or above for very long periods of time. In our atomic submarine fleet, the sailors typically go for months at a time with CO2 concentrations anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000 parts per million. CO2, which is safe for human beings, which is exhaled by humans at 40,000 parts per million, and now is about 400 parts per million in the atmosphere as a whole. CO2 is not a pollutant. Now, because human well-being depends heavily on access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, and because fossil fuels are, and for the foreseeable future will continue to be, along with nuclear and hydro, our best source of such energy, the demand to reduce our use of fossil fuels, to reduce our CO2 emissions, to reduce global warming, amounts to a demand to reduce human well-being, which I can illustrate for you quickly with just a few graphs. First of all, this graph shows CO2 emissions per capita versus child mortality rate. For the vast majority of the world, and this is in 1940, right? By the way, the circles represent nations, countries. The sizes indicate relative population, and the colors represent GDP per capita by nation. Yellow is high, green is upper middle, red is lower middle, blue is low, and colorless is not categorized. The higher a circle falls on the scale, the higher the per capita emissions of CO2. The farther to the right it falls on the scale, the higher the child mortality rate. In 1940, for the vast majority of the world's people, CO2 emissions clustered under 1/2 ton per capita, and child mortality rates clustered between 200 and 400 deaths per 1,000 children born. That's 20 to 40% out of all children died before their fifth birthdays. Higher emissions and lower child mortality rates and higher income levels clearly correlate. Now, we want child mortality rates to decline, don't we? If we graph that, we should see the circles moving to the left of the graph. Well, let's go to 2009. 69 years later, the circles have indeed shifted to the left, showing lower child mortality rates. They've also shifted upward, showing higher CO2 emission rates. In 2009, for the vast majority of the world's people, CO2 emissions cluster between 2 and 10 tons per capita. That's 4 to 40 times the emission rates of 1940. And child mortality rates cluster between 20 and 60 deaths by age 5 instead of 200 to 400. And that's about 1/3 to 1/20th of the 1940 rate. Higher emissions, lower child mortality rates, and higher income levels clearly correlate. I could also show you similar graphs regarding human life expectancy, but I'll skip those. They show the same story. But this next graph shows GDP per capita on the vertical scale as a function of hydrocarbon fuel use on the horizontal scale, from 1800 to 2010. As you can see, as hydrocarbon fuel use rises, GDP per capita rises. And listen, wealth is a good thing. Wealth is a good thing because it gets food and clothing and shelter and safe transportation and education and health care and purified water and sewage sanitation and all sorts of other things to people that make them healthier and allow them to live longer and more productive and more fruitful lives. The call to reduce our use of carbon-based fuels is, by implication, a call to reduce our wealth, which would bring about proportionate increases in infant and child mortality and declines in life expectancy, as well as other losses in human well-being. Now, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually acknowledges this, not explicitly. This graph is buried deep inside the fourth assessment report of 2007 from the IPCC. And what it shows is that today's poorest nations become the wealthiest at the end of this century and the end of the next century, not in the coolest scenarios for the global future, as if we had fought global warming, but in the warmest scenarios. Why is that? It's because the models derive the magnitude of warming from the amount of economic growth, and they derive the magnitude of economic growth from the use of fossil fuels. The lower the fossil fuel use, and hence CO2 emissions, and hence warming, the lower the economic growth, and therefore the poorer people will be in the future. The higher the CO2 emissions, and therefore the warming, the higher will be the wealth of the people in the future. In other words, even according to the IPCC's own modeling, assuming high warming effect of adding CO2 to the atmosphere, even according to the IPCC's own modeling on this, fighting global warming does more harm than good to the poor around the world. Now here's one little bit of an aside, an ethical point to consider. In the IPCC's modeling, all different scenarios show people in the future being wealthier than people today. In fact, in the IPCC's models, the nations that today are the poorest in the world will, by the end of this century, have GDP per capita that far exceeds today's GDP per capita in the United States. That means they're going to be pretty wealthy people. But we're being told that today we must reduce our CO2 emissions to fight global warming, even though that will impoverish people or trap in poverty those who are already impoverished. What that means is that we're being told that the poorer people of today must sacrifice for the sake of the richer people of tomorrow. Now, I'm sorry, I cannot see the moral sense in that. I think, in fact, that that is immoral. Now, what about these policies to fight global warming? In Rockford, we had a group similar to the one that was out in front here, with signs attacking me. And I went out and I talked with several of them, and I said, let me ask you a question. When the federal EPA issued the Clean Power Plan, which would cost us between $200 and $400 billion per year to implement, what did the EPA itself, which issued the rule, say would be the impact on global average temperature by implementing that rule? And their eyes kind of glazed over. They had no idea. They had never thought to ask the question. And one of them said, well, do you know? And I said, yes, I do. But I'm not going to tell you, because if you're going to be an activist on this sort of thing, you need to become well informed, and instead of just taking my word for it, you need to go out and look for the information. Look for what the EPA actually said. And then I said, let me ask you another question. Two questions, actually. One, assuming that the IPCC is right about how much warming comes from adding CO2 to the atmosphere, how much cooling would be achieved by full implementation of the Paris Climate Treaty through the end of this century? And, assuming that the negotiators of the treaty were right, how much will that cost to the world's economy? And again, completely clueless. They had no idea. I don't blame them for having no idea. Our media are not telling the story. By the way, I was a newspaper reporter, editor, and publisher. My father was a journalist all his life. I love journalism. But the reporter's job is really, really hard, and most reporters do not carefully search into things like this. Again, they didn't have any idea, and they said, do you know? And I said, yeah, I do know, but again, I'm not going to tell you. You need to go out and do your research and find it out. Now, I will tell you. The EPA, when it issued the Clean Power Plan, said that full implementation would reduce global average temperature by nothing. Zero. But we should do it because that would give us a position of moral leadership so the rest of the world would follow us in doing that. I'm not sure the rest of the world has always followed us all that well, right? But that was their argument. And full implementation of the Paris Climate Treaty on the assumption that they're right about how much cooling would be achieved by all of this would lower global average temperature in the year 2100 by 0.3 degree Fahrenheit, 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit. And what would it cost? Well, if everything was done really, really well, if the politicians didn't screw up some stuff, it would cost about $1 trillion per year to the global economy for every year from 2030 to 2100. But if the politicians messed things up, it could easily cost twice that much. In other words, $1 to $2 trillion per year, 70 years, that's 70 to 140 trillion dollars to achieve 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit reduction in global average temperature. That is $23.3 to $46.6 trillion per tenth of a degree Fahrenheit of cooling. I'm sorry, I don't think that's a good deal. I just don't. Especially when I remember that those trillions of dollars could instead be used to provide purified drinking water and sewage sanitation and nutrition supplements and infectious disease control and health care and safe and solid homes and electricity to light those homes and heat those homes and run computers in those homes so that the children can learn more, so that they can go out and become more productive than they would if they'd learn less, right? So that the people can have safe transportation and industry and all these different things that lift them out of poverty. What you spend on A, you cannot spend on B. So the Clean Power Plan and the Paris Climate Agreement are essentially prescriptions for trapping people in poverty for generations to come. That too, I think, is immoral. Now, a lot of people will respond, hey, look, I understand that energy is important. I know that. Why not get it from renewables instead of fossil fuels? These are clean, and after all, wind and sunshine are free. By the way, so are coal, oil, and natural gas. They're free. The cost is only a matter of extracting them from where they are and transforming them into usable things. Same thing applies to wind and sunshine. Well, the answer is magnitude, cost, and dependability. It's not just that we need energy, it's that we need abundant, affordable, reliable energy. Now take a look at this chart. This is from the Institute for Energy Research. As it shows, it's less expensive to generate that vast amount of steady, uninterrupted, on-demand electricity from fossil fuels than from wind and solar. Now there appears to be an exception here. And that is that it looks like the cost of onshore wind, first bar from the left of the right-hand part of the graph, okay? First bar from the left, is onshore wind. And the cost per megawatt hour of electricity generated from onshore wind is about $86.60. That's lower than for conventional coal, which is the first bar on the far left. That's $100.10 per megawatt hour. So that seems to indicate that onshore wind is a cheaper source of electricity than coal. But there is a hidden factor here, and that's the factor of what's called dispatchability. Electricity generated from coal is dispatchable. In other words, it is there, instantly available, without intermittency, without any interruption, without any increase or decrease. It is there instantly, on demand, whenever you want it, 24/7, 365. But that's not true of wind and solar. On average, 12 hours a day, the sun isn't shining. And in fact, you only really get good sunlight onto solar panels for a period of about 6 hours a day. That's the best that you can get. And the wind isn't always blowing. That means that electricity from wind and solar is non-dispatchable. In other words, it's subject to intermittency, and it requires instantaneous backup by dispatchable technologies. And that was the hidden factor. It's that backup factor that is so important. As the Institute for Energy Research explains, the more non-dispatchable power is used, the more the electrical system requires investments in dispatchable generation forms to back up its increased use, to back up the increased use of the renewable energy. Government policies that promote the use of non-dispatchable power are equivalent to requiring customs to buy and care for two vehicles, one that works when you need it, and another that works when it feels like it. Let me expand on that illustration just a little bit. You see, because wind and solar are intermittent, but you need an absolutely stable grid in order to keep from frying all the different electronic components out there, and in order to keep from having brownouts and blackouts during which people can die for lack of electricity, because wind and solar are intermittent, you have to have backup plants running 24/7, 365 at what's called spinning reserve. That's a low capacity use of the facility, but it has to be able to ramp up to 100% instantaneously, so fast that when a whole solar farm goes off grid because a big cloud came over, there is no interruption in the steady electricity. Now, spinning reserve is the least efficient speed for running a coal or natural gas plant. So what we're really being told by our government is you have to have two cars. One of them is your electric car, and you drive that when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. The other one is your gas or diesel-powered car. You have to keep that in your garage all the time, but you have to have it running all the time. And you have to put it on an automobile treadmill that is slanted like this, so that it's running uphill all the time, trying to accelerate. In other words, the least efficient way of running your car. You have to do both of those simultaneously all the time. Now, when you add in the cost of the backup to the cost of onshore wind, it turns out that cost of onshore wind is much, much higher than the cost for coal. The campaign to fight global warming by reducing fossil fuel use is, at bottom, a campaign to retain, especially in the world's poorest countries, what I've come to call the primitive energy system, and its accompanying low incomes and high rates of disease and premature death. It follows that such a policy should be taken only if its benefits clearly exceed its costs, and that can only be true if the amount of warming from added CO2 is very high indeed. In fact, much higher than the IPCC itself even claims. But as we saw earlier, the warming effect of CO2 is actually negligible. Now, the second great commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. In light of what I've presented here, I believe loving our neighbor implies rejecting the exaggerated claims of anthropogenic global warming, asserting the benefits of both the energy and the biological enhancement effects of fossil fuel use, and therefore rejecting calls to mitigate global warming by reducing CO2 emissions. As my friend Dr. John Christie, I've mentioned him before, a climatologist at the University of Alabama, who's a former missionary in Kenya, explains, the primitive energy system works this way. The average sub-Saharan African woman spends 6 to 8 hours a day doing nothing but gathering wood and dried dung with which she cooks her food and heats her hut. They are her principal heating and cooking fuels. That leaves her precious little time and precious little bodily energy to do anything else to lift herself and her children out of poverty. Smoke from her burning those kills about 2 to 4 million people per year, according to the World Health Organization, but hundreds of millions of others get the upper respiratory diseases and eye diseases that, even though they're not fatal, reduce their ability to work and lift themselves out of poverty. So that primitive energy system traps them in long-term poverty. The poor of this world desperately need to replace that primitive energy system with the modern one, in which coal, natural gas, and nuclear materials are used to generate clean electricity, delivered at scale, meaning in utterly enormous quantities, so gigantic you cannot begin to imagine. And not only at scale, but on demand, instantly, whenever you need it, without interruption, meaning no brownouts and no blackouts, delivered through grids, which are the only way to deliver this vast amount of energy affordably. And it's used not only for cooking and heating, the only uses of those 6 hours a day worth of labor that sub-Saharan African woman has, but also for light and refrigeration and automated clothes washing and drying and computing and industry and business and commerce and healthcare, pretty much everything we do. 24/7, 365. And here in America, the average worker gets all that energy for the wages that he earns in about 20 to 30 minutes per day, leaving him, by comparison with that sub-Saharan African woman, with an extra 5.5 to 7.5 hours of work time per day to produce other things than energy. And we wonder why the Africans are so poor. And like them, billions in Asia and Latin America. Well, what are some things that you can do? What are some things that you can do? First of all, you need to learn a whole lot more than what I've covered in this talk. I would urge you to come to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org, where you will find hundreds of articles and a number of major papers done by our roughly 65 scholars in our network, about a third of them natural scientists, a third of them economists, and a third of them theologians, philosophers, and ethicists. You will find there these papers and these articles that can help you to learn so much more about this. And read them for yourself, but also share them with others. Share them on your Facebook page. Share them through Twitter. Share them all sorts of different ways. Print them out and hand them to your neighbors. Subscribe to our email newsletter. And when you get it, forward it to friends so that they can learn too. Contact your members of Congress, your members of state legislature, your city councilmen and county councilmen, and tell them, look, I don't want us to be fighting global warming, because the only way to do that is to impoverish people. Point them to our literature to educate them as well. And also, especially for young people, we have a blog called earthrisingblog.com. earthrisingblog.com. Come to that and learn more. Send your young friends to that for them to learn more. And finally, please pray for us. We definitely need your prayers. We are in spiritual warfare here, and the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are spiritual, to the tearing down of strongholds and to the destruction of every argument that asserts itself against the rule of God. And our aim is to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Our own thoughts, the thoughts of our brothers and sisters in Christ, and even the thoughts of unbelievers. That's what we're working for. And so I would ask you to pray for us, and I would ask you to support us financially as well. I'm a whole lot more generous than Dave. You know, he wants you to become regular donors, but he says a one-time gift of $1 million, that'll do instead. I'll take a one-time gift of $100,000. No, seriously, anything you can give, we would seriously appreciate. We operate on a shoestring budget. And we try to be very, very good stewards of all of that. Now, I thank you very, very much. You've been patient. I've gone on for a little while. We will have a question and answer period, but at first, David has a few words to say.
All right. Let's give Dr. Calvin Beisner a hand, please.